Alrighty then, guys. Welcome back. Today we're going to keep talking about some economics Q&A questions. And for those of you who haven't been with us before, so what we're basically done here is we've taken a collection of questions that are often missed in the field of micro or macroeconomics, and we're going to be redoing these questions, getting the right answer, and then checking a previously filled in answer by another tutor to make sure that the answer is correct. The questions will be displayed on the left with the previous answers, and then the my solution or whatever scratch work I'm doing is going to be on the right. Again, I've not really taken a look at these answers before. I'm going to be doing this along just with you, at the same time as you guys, and so why don't we just get started and jump right in. So the first question that we're working with today says, high government expenditures can lead to a bigger, which one of the following? So it says revenue for number one, stimulus for number two, deficit for number three, and surplus for number four. And so, looking at the answer choices, we can eliminate some of them. So number one, revenue really refers to the government's income through taxes, right? Like that's the government's major source of income every single year, and then you can think of government expenditures as its spending. So it's just like we have income and spending, government also has income and spending. So revenue is going to be more on the income side, less so on the spending side, right? And so government expenditures is going to be pretty independent from how much revenue is generated. Number two is stimulus. This is something that is a little bit more tricky. Stimulus refers to basically allowing the economy to grow a little bit faster, and so high government expenditures can lead to a bigger stimulus. And so we're going to keep an eye on the answer and see if we come up with any better answers. Third is deficit, and so deficit is again another great answer because the deficit is made up of when government spends more than it receives in taxes, and so when expenditures are greater than tax revenue, you have what is known as a deficit. And so, obviously, by increasing government expenditures, we would also expect to see larger deficits, holding tax revenue equal, right? And so, that's something that we want to be definitely considering very heavily, and we're going to revisit stimulus and deficits as our two final answer choices. And finally, four, surplus. High government expenditures can lead to a bigger deficit for sure, but a surplus is actually when government expenditures are less than what the government receives in tax revenue, and therefore the government actually has money left over that it can use to apply to, paying off debt or something like that. So we would expect government expenditure to actually be low when we're dealing with a surplus rather than high, and so we're not going to be picking between that and surplus. So we're left with stimulus and deficit, and so between these two, stimulus is going to be a weaker answer just because it's not a direct correlation where government expenditures are tied to stimulus. It's often that government expenditures can be high with the intention of creating some sort of economic stimulus, but they are not tied in the same way to this concept that deficit is, where where government expenditure is literally a part of the formula to calculate deficit, where deficit is equal to is equal to tax revenue minus government expenditure, right? And so in that sense, if you increase government expenditure, you by definition are leading to a greater deficit, holding tax revenue equal. So that's probably going to be the best answer, and we would go with that for this question. So let's take a look at the answer choices. And so the answer choices provided by the previous tutor say deficit, which is good. And they say government budget balance, also known as the fiscal balance, compares the revenue generated by the government through its nominal charges on public services and goods and through tax receipts, the expenditures that the government makes. Exactly. So that's so far so good. Government budget balance is positive when revenue receipts exceed expenditures, and negative when revenue receipts are less than the expenditures. If government expenditures are high, it can lead to a bigger deficit provided expenditures exceed revenues. A negative budget balance is known as a fiscal deficit, whereas a positive budget balance is known as a fiscal surplus. Yep, and so we can clarify one thing, and just to make it absolutely clear that the budget balance is equal to revenue minus expenditures. And so otherwise, great answer. And so we wanted to clarify that relationship just to make it super, super clear. But other than that, this is a spot on answer, and we find no problems with it. Right, so we're going to mark that correct, and we can move on to the next answer. Okay, so this next question refers to long-run macroeconomic equilibrium. It says long-run macroeconomic equilibrium occurs when which of the following is true? And it says A is aggregate demand equals short-run aggregate supply. B is aggregate demand equals short-run aggregate supply, and they intersect at a point on the long-run supply curve. C is unemployment equals 0, and D is output is above potential GDP. And so what this is really going to refer to is the dynamic aggregate demand aggregate supply model, and that's going to be most memorable as one of those graphs that you just have to be familiar with and know how to interact with, right? So we can refer to that over here. I'll just draw out what the dynamic ADAS graph would look like. So we have price on the y-axis, quantity on the x-axis, and then we have first let's do a straight line, and this is I'll look at the top, long run aggregate supply. We're going to have short-run aggregate demand, or not short-run, just regular aggregate demand, although we typically think about this in the short run because aggregate demand doesn't have a long-run value. And then intersecting at the exact same point, we have short-run aggregate supply. And so this is what we would say is the long-run condition for the dynamic aggregate demand aggregate supply model. And the reason is because all three lines we have are intersecting at the same place. Short-run aggregate supply refers to in the near term where some variables are fixed. What does the aggregate supply look like? Aggregate demand is again in the short term because demand is pretty dependent on certain factors that are always variable. And then long-run aggregate supply refers to if we find all supply variables to be, or supply factors to be variable, what is the full potential output of the economy, aka potential GDP, right? And so if we maximize production, what would in the long run, what would we expect GDP to be? And so for us to have them all intersecting implies that we are currently in the long run because our current GDP production level is the exact same as the long run aggregate supply potential GDP, and that is what we would refer to as the long run equilibrium. And in the long run, we wouldn't expect any changes to this kind of system, right? To have this relationship, there is no reason that we expect deviation from this equilibrium unless one of the curves were to shift again. And this can be differentiated, from the short-run aggregate supply curve, which can look something like this, right? Or not short-run aggregate supply curve, but a short-run equilibrium, which can look anything like this. We still have our long-run aggregate supply, and then instead of having an intersection on the long-run aggregate supply curve, we might have intersection a little bit before or a little bit after, right? And so both of these are possible intersection points, and this would be what is known as contractionary gap, and this would be expansionary gap. And essentially saying in the short run, GDP is not the same as potential GDP that we would see in the long run, and therefore there's some sort of deviation, and we would know that we're in the short run because the economy cannot sustain output at either of these levels because they would be either inefficient or just impossible to do. And so that's kind of the way we want to think about the dynamic aggregate supply aggregate demand model. So keeping all that in mind, we can go back to our answer choices, and it becomes clear that answer choice B is going to be the best answer choice for our needs. It says aggregate demand equals short run aggregate supply, and they intersect at a point on the long run aggregate supply curve. And so again, uh, you know, we have our short run equilibrium intersection is the intersection of aggregate demand and short run aggregate supply, and then our long run equilibrium is going to be the straight line, and if they both coincide, then we have what is known as the long run macroeconomic equilibrium. So let's take a look at what the previous tutor said. The previous tutor said B, aggregate demand equals short run aggregate supply, and they intersect at a point on the long run supply curve. And they said in the long run, GDP is determined where short run aggregate demand curve and short run supply curve and long run in the supply curve all meet at one single point. Long run equilibrium is stable and struck after GDP gaps are liquidated, implying that in the long run actual GDP must coincide the potential GDP. When there's a long run macroeconomic equilibrium in the current economy, current GDP is equal to long run potential GDP, and that there is no inflation. Okay, so some grammar issues. We're going to rewrite some of this to make it a little bit more clear. Grammar issues. So in the long we can say long run aggregate supply is represented by V, and it's great that they can include this graph, which is super helpful. So by the vertical line on the graph, and is defined as the potential GDP of the economy, assuming it is operating at full capacity with all factors variable. And then the short run aggregate supply, and so short run equilibrium occurs when short run aggregate supply is equal to intersects aggregate demand. Long run equilibrium occurs when this intersection occurs at a point on the long run aggregate supply curve. If this long run equilibrium means there are no, so we're going to rephrase that last sentence, which is pretty good. Means current GDP is equal to potential GDP, and there are no inflationary or recessionary gaps at this time. And so that's going to be a probably more a more accurate solution with some of the clarity issues figured out. But otherwise, we're going to add a great graph because that's really, really helpful. I think it'd be really hard to understand this answer solution without drawing a graph, or without at least knowing about this graph. And so it's great that they include that. And so otherwise, the solution is correct. And so we're going to mark this as all good. Okay, and so the next question says, what best describes what occurs in the product market? And so this is pretty much a definition question. And so in that sense, there's not going to be scratch work involved here. And so the definition of a product market is basically one where there is an exchange of money for final goods and services. So it is not one of those markets where you're seeing, suppliers who are negotiating for parts from their vendors or anything like that. The product market is where consumers go to buy final goods and services. And so we're going to look at the answer choices to make sure, maybe some of these answer choices line up with what we expect to see. So question choice A says the exchange of labor for capital. So again, that's not going to be a product market. That's going to be like individual exchange, basically like a job, right? Like looking for exchange, but a job is not a final good or service, right? And so that is not what we think of when we think about final goods. So that's not going to be the right answer. So B says the exchange of goods and services for factors of production. And again, we said that this is not going to be one of those situations where suppliers are exchanging goods and services that they plan on using as inputs for their own production, aka suppliers and vendors. And so we're not going to choose B for this product market definition either. C says the exchange of goods and services for money. And that does seem to be about the same definition as what we're looking at. The only thing that would make it better is if it said the exchange of final goods and services for money. But we can take a look at the other ones. And then the D says the exchange of money for factors of production. And again, this is very similar to B in terms of this is describing the relationship between suppliers and vendors, not between final sellers and consumers. And so we're not going to pick D as well. So C is going to be the right answer here. The exchange of goods and services for money is what best describes what occurs in the product market. So let's take a look at the answer choices provided by the previous tutor. So the previous tutor says, as we know, a market is a place where buyers and sellers come in contact with each other for buying and selling of any type of goods and services. For different goods, there are different markets like the labor market, the product market, etc. Product market is a market where final products or goods are bought and sold and does not include the intermediate goods or raw material. So the best description of what occurs in the product market is the exchange of goods and services for money. Therefore, option C is the correct option. So yeah, it's very good. You can say some minor grammatical issues, but otherwise, great answer. And I think that, again, covers the same rationale behind the definition that we talked about. So we're just mark that as correct, and we can move on to the next question. Alrighty, so this question, I think this is one of those where, yeah, we have several questions related to GDP. So let's take a shot at these. So the first question says, if an economy's GDP falls, then it must be the case that the economy's, and A says, income and savings fall. B says, income and market value of all production both fall. C says, income falls and market value of all production rises. And D says, income rises and market value of all production falls. And so I think what this is really testing in this question is again, more of a theory basis, not really a calculation question. And it's asking us if we understand the different ways that we can calculate GDP. And so GDP can be calculated in several ways. The one that you might be most familiar with is the expenditure approach. And so that is basically adding up consumption, investment, government spending, and exports to get our final GDP figure. But there are also other approaches like the income approach, which adds up all of the income that the different parties in the United States receive. And the reason that while both seemingly distinct ways to calculate GDP, they always give you the same number because any expenditure that is made by anybody in the United States is going to be equal to income that another party receives, right? So let's take consumption that the expenditure approach would add in. If I go and I spend money on a car, that is going to be factored into the expenditure approach with the amount of money that I spent adding into overall GDP. The income approach would instead say, don't worry about me spending the 40,000. Worry about the car seller receiving 40,000. And in that sense, we see that again, all spending is equal to income from someone else. So if we take away the parties that are interested. And so that's a key relationship to understand. And so taking a look at the answer choices, we can see that A says income and savings fall, and this is tricky because income is going to be one of those approaches, but saving does not necessarily fall, right? Because it's possible that saving goes up, but the government expenditure goes down at the same time. And I think saving falling is one of those things that can contribute to, uh, sorry, a fall in savings, yeah. So savings falling is going to contribute to a GDP rise because if savings fall, then consumption increases, and that's going to actually increase GDP, and therefore we're not going to really see A as a viable answer choice. B says income and market value of all production both fall. And this is going to be a really attractive answer choice, right? We have the income, which we would see in the income approach, and market value of all production is the general definition for GDP. That, and we would see also that under the expenditure approach. And so B is going to be a very strong answer, and we're going to take a look at the other ones to make sure we're not missing anything here. C says income falls and the market value of all production rises. So here we see the reverse relationship that we saw in B, and we're not going to be keen on C because if GDP falls, by definition, the market value of all production falls because the market value of all production is the definition of GDP. And so we're not going to see C as a good answer choice. And D says income rises and market value of all production falls. And again, like we said before, GDP, whether you use the income approach or the expenditure approach, is going to be the same. And so it's not possible for there to be opposing forces of a rise in income, but also a fall in market value. Similarly, if GDP falls, income must fall because if the income approach demands that GDP can be calculated by totaling all income in the country. And so B is going to be our best answer choice here. If the economy's GDP falls, then it must be the case that the economy's income and market value of all production both fall. So let's take a look at the answer choice provided by the previous tutor. So the previous tutor says GDP is equal to price times total production. So if GDP falls, then either P or Y may fall or both fall. If income falls, then saving will also fall, as saving is directly related to income. And I think this is going to be the wrong answer choice. I want to push back on this answer choice, right? So the tutor says if income falls, then saving will also fall, as saving is directly related to income. While this may be true, we have to think about income not just as income to people, right? Like the income approach is looking at income for all parties, businesses, companies, everybody involved in the country. And so, to the savings is going to be particularly relevant to when we say disposable income is equal to savings plus income. Disposable income is equal to savings plus consumption. That's directly related to personal consumption, but it may not be the case for other interested parties. And so I don't necessarily think that income falling and savings falling will be the best answer. And like we said before, one of the best answers was answer choice B because it again tells us that yes, there's a relationship between income and GDP, and when GDP falls, that income is also going to fall. But also by definition, GDP refers to the total market value of all final goods and services produced in the economy in a given period of time. And so if GDP falls, then we have to assume that the final value of all goods and services has also fallen. And so we're going to kind of correct this answer in this answer choice right here. So we're going to say it's actually going to be B, right? Is it B? Yeah. And so this is a better answer because it ties in the concept of the because as we know from the income approach to calculating GDP, GDP is regulated. GDP is tied to the amount of income earned by parties in the entire country. So if GDP were to fall, then we would absolutely see a fall in income as well. Similarly, GDP is defined as the value of all final goods and services produced in a country, and this is what we would call the production approach. And if we were to see a fall in GDP, then we would have to see a fall in the value of all final goods and services produced in the country as well. And we can add a quick note that says A gets the income approach relationship correct, but confuses savings, personal savings, with national savings. And so that's not going to be the right answer. So we're going to add this as a correction to this first answer choice. So let's take a look at answer choice B. So answer choice B says, gross domestic product measures which of the following? And it says, A says income and expenditure, B says income, C says expenditure, and D says neither. Again, we said you can measure GDP through both the income approach and the expenditure approach, and both approaches will give you equal end GDP values. And so we're going to probably say income and expenditure is measured by both. It is a weird phrasing of the question because you would not add in income and expenditures when calculating GDP at the same time. You can do either or and not both. And so, but I think this question could be written better. But I will say that income and expenditure is going to be the best solution if we want to incorporate all the different approaches. So T says GDP measures both income as well as expenditures by nationals of the country. Income is what is used as a factor payment. Income is what is earned as a factor payment is used to purchase a product from the market. Right, and so for 2, that gets the relationship correct, and we just say A is correct. Income is one person's income is another person's expenditure, and so both the income and expenditure approach yield the same GDP value. Great, so that's going to be correct. 3 says, if all quantities produced in the United States rise by 13.4% and all prices fall by 13.4%, which of the following occurs? Does real GDP rise or fall? Does nominal GDP rise or fall? And so here we're really talking about the difference between real and nominal GDP. And the real difference is that real GDP holds all prices constant, and so is not affected by inflation or deflation or changes in price basket value, or specifically the price component of price baskets. Whereas nominal GDP does not control for prices, and so can be influenced by the different fluctuations of prices as well as fluctuations in quantity produced. So taking a look and knowing those definitions, if real GDP, if quantities produced rises by 13.4% and then prices fall by 13.4%, real GDP would not be affected by the price change at all because it holds prices constant. And so the only thing affecting real GDP is going to be the rise in quantity produced. And so we would see that real GDP increases despite prices decreasing. On the other hand, nominal GDP is affected by both quantities produced and prices fluctuation because it's defined as P times Y, where P is variable. And so in this case, the two directional changes would probably cancel out, and we would see no change in nominal GDP because the direction or quantity change is going to be the same in terms of quantity versus prices. So we're going to pick no change for nominal, no change for real. Increase in real, no change in nominal. So here we see real GDP is given by Y, nominal GDP is equal to GDP, price is equal to P. Nominal GDP is given by price times Y, where a change in GDP is given by the change in price plus the change in Y. Change in nominal GDP is given by the change in price plus the change in production. So real GDP is change in quantity, so it rise by 13.4%, and that is correct, and nominal GDP will remain unchanged. So yep, this is a good solution. 4 says, which of the following does not add to United States GDP? And it gives several scenarios. It says, A says the federal government sends a social security check to your grandmother. B says the city of New York pays a salary to a policeman. C says the Air France buys a plane from Boeing, the U.S. aircraft manufacturer. And so let's taking a look at these answer choices. What we're keeping in mind again here is how can we categorize each of these into one of these subcategories in the expenditure approach. So Y is equal to consumption plus investment plus government spending plus net exports. And so let's take a look at the first question choice. So it says the federal government sends a social security check to your grandmother, and we take a look at our consumption approach, and we don't find that this type of payment is falling under any of our categories. And the reason for that is because the GDP explicitly does not include government transfer payments to its citizens. And so social security check is what we would consider a transfer payment of money from the government into the hands of your grandmother. And it was not done in exchange for a good or services. It was simply a transfer of money. And so because by definition GDP does not include transfer payments, A is going to be a really strong contender for not adding to the US GDP. And take a look at the other answer choices just to make sure. B says the city of New York pays a salary to policemen. And so we can think about that as government expenditure, spending money on the private sector, or not the private sector, but spending money that flows into the hands of people. So that's possibly going to add to GDP. And then C says Air France buys a plane from Boeing, the United States aircraft manufacturer, and that's going to increase net exports, right? We can think of if Air France buys a plane from Boeing, then Boeing is shipping off a plane that was built in the United States to an international purchaser, and that is what we call an export. And so if that happens, then that export is going to increase. So overall, we would say A is going to be the best answer choice here because it defines a transfer payment that is not usually included in GDP calculation. So 4 says A, yep, transfer payments are excluded from the accounting of US GDP. So that's great. So let's take a look at the next question, which says 5. Is the best single measure of a society's economic well-being the unemployment rate or the GDP? And so this is, again, a very conceptual question. It has nothing to do with calculations or anything like that. And so what is commonly accepted as a single best measure of a society's economic well-being is the GDP, and that's because the GDP represents total value produced in the country, and if we were to divide that by the population, we would get GDP per capita, which is on average the value available or resources available to the average citizen. And so economic well-being can be very, not very strongly, but it is usually estimated through the overall GDP. Unemployment rate is going to be kind of tied to the business cycle, but it is less significant of an indicator of economic well-being as the direction of GDP growth or decline. And so we're going to pay more attention to GDP than unemployment. So let's take a look at what the answer choice says. It says GDP is the best measure of societal well-being as unemployment rate and GDP are indirectly related, and GDP measures the standard of living of people in monetary terms. So using GDP, we can measure both. And so that is very accurate as well. If GDP is declining, the likelihood is that unemployment rate is high, and the vice versa is true. And so GDP, again, is the go-to measure to measure the standard of living in countries as well. And so with all these things being said, we think that GDP would most likely be the best single measure of a society's economic well-being. Alrighty, so the next question says, Keynesian economics was developed by John Keynes in response to either the Great Recession or the Great Depression. And so, you know, this is again a definition-based question. Not really based on any calculation. Keynesian economics refers to the idea developed by John Keynes that was that government should intervene in markets to increase economic recovery and to speed up basically recovery from economic downturn. And so this was developed a fairly long time ago, and it was developed in response to the Great Depression, which was happening in the 20th century, right? And so John Keynes set out after the Great Depression to understand the role that government should play in getting the economy back on its feet. And so this was kind of the approach developed by the government at the time, which was to pass the New Deal, spend a ton of money on public works, hire a lot of people, and that was what kind of helped bring us out of the Great Depression. And so Keynesian economics is one school of thought in economics that government should be active in responding to economic downturn. Even if we didn't know the background for Keynesian economics, we can know that the Great Depression is probably going to be the right answer rather than the Great Recession, because the Great Recession oftentimes refers to the 2008 fiscal crisis, financial crisis, and so that is way too recent to be the reason that Keynesian economics was developed, because this is a very old and traditional school of economic thought. So the Great Depression is going to be the right answer here. 6 says, Keynesian economics was developed in response to the Great Depression to show the impact of expansionary fiscal policy on the economy. So yeah, we would pick that as the right answer. Excuse me, I didn't see this last one. Out of control government spending is one, and again, Keynesian economics actually thinks that government spending would be good, not bad. It proposes more government spending as a reason or as a tool to get us out of economic downturn. So it's not going to be C as well. Okay, 17 says, for the economy as a whole, wages must equal profit, consumption must equal income, income must equal expenditure, or consumption must equal savings. And this touches upon, again, what we were talking about in the beginning with the relationship between the income and expenditure approach. We basically see that any one person's income must be someone else's expenditure, and the opposite is true. Any person's expenditure must end up being someone else's income. And so that is why we can take two entirely different approaches to calculating GDP, one by adding up everybody's income and another by adding up all the expenditures of a people to come up with the same figure. And so that relationship is key, and therefore for an economy as a whole, we would see that to be true. We can take a look at the other answer choices. A says wages must equal profit. Again, that is not necessarily the case. You can have capital that is reinvested, or profit that is reinvested into the company rather than paid off as wages, and that's not going to be the case. So A is not going to be the right answer. B says consumption must equal income. Again, we see right here that consumption and income are both separate. Not income, not investment, income. So consumption must equal income. Again, consumption is not tied directly into expenditure. Consumption can refer to a subcategory of expenditure, but there are a lot of other types of expenditure. For example, government expenditure that would not fall under consumption, and so it is not necessarily the case that consumption must equal income. C says income must equal expenditure, and that is our favorite answer choice here because we know that relationship is true. And then D says consumption must equal savings. And again, we said that with disposable income, you can either have consumption, use it for consumption or for savings. So you would really have income is equal to consumption plus savings. But the distribution of income between consumption and savings, is very variable, and it does not have to be 50-50. It can be more consumption or less consumption than savings, and that would be totally fine. And so our final answer choice is going to be C, income must equal expenditure for an economy as a whole. And we see here, the previous tutor agrees as well. Income must equal expenditure as what is earned as a factor payment is used to purchase the goods and services from the market. And so I think that relationship can be a bit more clarified, but we can say 7 says C is correct. one person's, and so we take the same answer that we said before. One person's income is another person's expenditure, and that is why the income and expenditure approach yield the same GDP value. And so that would be what we end up talking about for this question here. 8 says, as in the case of Ireland, Keynesian economics does not tend to work in countries which are A, large and self-sustaining, B, small and insulated, C, medium-sized with good governments, D, smaller and open to free-ish trade, E says large and have free trade. And so, in this question, you're basically saying, what are reasons why Keynesian economics might not work? And so, again, as a refresher, Keynesian economics refers to when the domestic government engages in fiscal policy, either lowering taxes or increasing government spending in order to help stimulate the economy and kind of meet the needs of economy in terms of growth. There are some reasons this might not work, and as is hinted by the example given, which is Ireland, one of those examples is if the economy as a whole is relatively small, and if it's open to free trade, the domestic government might not play as large of a role in stimulating the economy as the world economy does. And so it is in cases of small countries, which have small governments which don't have large impacts on fiscal policy, and are simultaneously very connected to the global market, then it is going to be global market influences that have the largest influence on economic health, and the domestic government spending or policies are going to be relatively minor compared to the global forces that play in the market. And so we can take a look at the answer choices. A says large and self-sustaining. That's a perfect kind of situation for where Keynesian economics would thrive. There's no interconnectedness or trade. It's a large economy, and so Keynesian economics would work very well here. B says small and insulated. Again, this would be fine because even though it's a small economy, the insulation prevents there from being global influences on the economy, and so it's still going to be government policy that tends to work. C says medium-sized with good governments. It's really not I think those are, again, conditions in which Keynesian economics could work. And again, it's not really the idea of a good government, more of a government able to execute its policies. And so, these are all, a good government is not going to prevent Keynesian economics from hurting, surely. D says smaller and open to free trade, and that's what we're going to be focusing on. And C says large and have free trade. And so, this is maybe a close second, because if you have free trade, there's going to be global influences. But with a large country with a large economy, there is also going to be ability for governments to do a lot in terms of the fiscal policy that it has. And so we're going to go with D, countries which are smaller and open to free trade. And that is the same answer that the previous tutor says. D, small and open to free trade, as the world economy will have a large impact on domestic economy. And so we find we've had a couple corrections, but most of these corrections are just minor things, and the previous tutor got most of these questions exactly correct. So we're going to mark this as one of these questions we said was incorrect, so we'll say incorrect, but for the most part we know that a lot of those are correct. Okay, so let's move on to the next question. So the next question says, one method for studying opportunity costs is to think in terms of which of the following. It says A, trade-offs, B, pros and cons, C, trial and error, and D, cause and effect. And so when we think of opportunity costs, we define it as, what are you when you make a decision, what are you giving up, and what is the next best thing that you could have done? And so that is going to be very, very similar to trade-offs, which is, again, if we think about the 10 fundamental principles of economics, this is one of them. Everybody faces trade-offs and resources are scarce. And so this is going to be especially the case when we think about microeconomics. And again, opportunity cost is very similar to the idea that every decision you make has a trade-off, and therefore it is not just the money that you spend on making a decision, but also the opportunity that you give up in order to pursue a different decision. So we're going to be looking at trade-offs very closely. B says pros and cons, and so this is more like a decision-making mechanism, but is not really tied to the idea of opportunity cost. C says trial and error, and that's more of a scientific concept than an economic one. And D is also cause and effect, and that's a scientific concept, not really an economic one. And so we're going to probably say A is right, that one method for studying opportunity cost is to think in terms of trade-offs. So let's take a look at the prior answer choices. The answer chosen by the previous tutor. And they also said trade-offs, and they said scarcity is a fundamental problem in economics. Since every resource is scarce, we face trade-offs while we have to go in favor of a particular economic decision or action that yields the greatest utility or benefit to us, forgoing all the other options. The value is the next best alternative, and that key phrase, next best alternative, is really the definition of opportunity cost. And that becomes the opportunity cost of the action. Looking at the trade-offs and determining the sacrifices made in the trade-off is the best method to study opportunity costs. And so that is a correct answer, and there's no real issues with that, so that's very clear. Great answer. Very concise. And we can move on to the next question. So the next question says, if a shortage exists in the market, then we know that the actual price is below the equilibrium and the quantity supplied is greater than quantity demanded, below the equilibrium price and the quantity demanded is greater than quantity supplied, above the equilibrium price and quantity supplied is greater than quantity demanded, and above the equilibrium price and the quantity demanded is greater than the quantity supplied. And so what we really want to do here is figure out what does the shortage look like, and we can either visualize this in our head, but just for the sake of clarity, I'll draw this out. So we're talking about a conventional supply and demand model right here, right? We have price on the y-axis, quantity on the x-axis. We have our demand. We have our supply and demand. And what is a shortage? A shortage was when demand is going to be greater than supply, and so we can think about it as a situation, maybe something around here. And what we have here is we have quantity demanded exceeding quantity supplied at price 1. And so this is going to be the condition for a shortage, right? At this price, too many people want the good, and there are not enough suppliers willing to supply the good. And so we find that that relationship is the one we want to look for. And again, this is going to be at a price that is less than P star or P equilibrium, which is the equilibrium point. And so let's take a look at the answer choices. So it says below the equilibrium price, so correct so far, and quantity supplied is greater than quantity demanded. And that is the opposite of the relationship we were looking for. So we're not going to choose that one. And it says, so A is not right. And number 2 says below the equilibrium price and the quantity demanded is greater than quantity supplied. That is the case that we're looking for. And so we can just make sure none of the other answer choices are right. And 3 and 4 both say above the equilibrium price. And we already know that for a shortage to exist, it has to be below the equilibrium price. So it's not going to be 3 or 4. I'm pretty confident that number 2 is the right answer, and that's what we'll end up choosing. So let's take a look at the answer choices, and it says, number 2, below the equilibrium price and the quantity demanded is greater than quantity supplied. When the market price is less than the equilibrium price, the quantity demanded increases while the quantity supplied decreases due to the negative and positive relationship both variables have with price, respectively. As the quantity demanded exceeds quantity supplied in the market, a shortage of goods or services is created. The opposite of a shortage is a surplus that exists when the quantity supplied equals quantity demanded. This is achieved when the actual price is greater than the market equilibrium. So yeah, great analysis. For more clarity, revisit a graph depicting a shortage. And so as long as we keep this graph relationship in mind, we're not going to have any problems with these types of shortage questions. So let's take a look at the next question. So it says, number 22, the law of diminishing marginal return states that A, as the size of a firm's plant increases, average cost eventually decreases. B says, as a firm uses more of a variable factor of production with a given factor given quantity of the fixed factor of production, the marginal product of the variable factor eventually diminishes. C says as the size of a plant increases, marginal product eventually decreases. D says as a firm uses more of a variable factor of production, total product eventually decreases. And E says as a firm uses more of a variable factor of production, its average cost eventually decreases. And so what we're looking at here is the relationship between diminishing marginal returns and basically the definition that it has, right? And so let's go down the line here and kind of see which one of these answer choices is going to be the best. So the first answer choice says, as the size of a firm's plant increases, average cost eventually decreases. So the first thing we have to note is that the law of diminishing marginal returns applies to all variable factors of production. And so increasing the size of a firm's plant is not going to be really all-encompassing of the range of factors of production that the law of diminishing marginal returns could apply to. And second, average cost eventually decreasing refers primarily, I would say, to maybe economies of scale. And so as the size of a firm's plant increases, average cost is going to decrease for a certain extent, but as you continue to increase, the average cost is still going to increase overall, because the law of diminishing marginal returns states that I guess it becomes more expensive to incorporate fixed factors or variable factors of production over time. And so we would not necessarily see that average cost is going to be really decreasing forever. So we're not going to favor choice A. B says, as a firm uses more of a variable factor of production with a given quantity of the fixed factor of production, the marginal product of the variable factor eventually diminishes. And this is much better of an answer because, again, we see it's a very broad category of things. It uses any variable factor of production, not just a plant's size. And the key thing here is the idea that the marginal product of the variable factor eventually diminishes. And so when we think of the law of diminishing marginal returns, we can think of something like adding more employees. So you might add the first employee is maybe the most productive. The second employee is a little bit less productive. And if you have 100 employees cramped into a small room, you actually have that 100th employee doing very, very little to increase the overall production that only he can add. And so in that sense, the marginal product of the variable factor eventually diminishing is exactly what the law of diminishing marginal returns is trying to state. And so B is going to be a great answer. Let's make sure that none of the answer choices are better. C says, as the size of a plant increases, marginal product eventually decreases. And again, we said that the size of a plant is not encompassing enough of all the variable factors of production for this to be what the overall law of marginal diminishing returns is aimed at. So it's not going to be C. D says, as a firm uses more of a variable factor of production, total product eventually decreases. And so this can be construed to be fairly similar to answer choice B, but if we see here that instead of referring to the marginal product of the variable factor, it refers to total product. And so we have to talk, this is hinted at in the word marginal in the law of diminishing marginal returns, but we're always talking about marginal production. Total production, even if marginal production is very low, total production is still increasing. And for total production to decrease, we'd actually have to see marginal product decreasing as negative as well. And so that's very hard to see in most circumstances. And so it is very certainly not the definition of the law of diminishing marginal returns for total product to be decreasing, because that is a totally separate issue, not on the margin. So it's not going to be D. And E says, as a firm uses more of a variable factor of production, its average cost eventually decreases. We touched upon this earlier, but as you continue to use variable factors of production, it can become more and more expensive to continue to use those variables. And so we would actually maybe see average costs eventually increasing rather than decreasing. And so E is not going to be the right answer here. And so B is going to be the best answer here. A lot of diminishing marginal return states, as a firm uses more of a variable factor of production with a given quantity of the fixed factor of production, the marginal product of the variable factor eventually diminishes. And so let's take a look at what the answer choice that the tutor provided. And they also said the correct answer is B. The law of diminishing marginal return states, as a firm So basically restating the answer choice. And so again, yeah, this is correct. This is a concept that students will just have to memorize. Right, and so this is again not really a calculation-based concept, and really just testing your knowledge of some of these terms. Okay, so let's take a look at the next question. And it says, in a market economy, economic activity is guided by which of the following? Or I guess it's not multiple choice, so it's guided by what? And so a couple things going on here. Again, this is first of all, again, not a calculation-based question. It is a conceptual question. And so to say, so we would just have to kind of be familiar with these terms in order to answer this question. The term market economy refers to one of several different types of economy, for example, command economy or a mixed economy. And so the question is asking us what differentiates or defines a market economy. And so if we remember from our textbooks or class concepts, a market economy is guided by two things: free market forces like supply and demand, and self-interest. And so there's an assumption of the invisible hand that everybody acts in their own self-interest, and the interaction of free market forces and self-interest are what drives the market economy. And so there's not going to be any guiding by government, because this is not a command economy, it's not a mixed economy. There's no role for governments to play in this kind of dynamic for the market economy. Well, taking a look at the answer choices, we see that they also got it right. Talk about free market forces and self-interest. And they further go on to explain that in a market economy, decisions regarding any economic activity are guided by price signals and free market forces. In this kind of system, the presence of factor markets is significant and valuable. State activity is restricted or minimum, and resources are privately owned. All economic decisions in a market economy are driven by the aggregate associations of the individual citizens and businesses. The system is the opposite of a centrally planned economy that comprises the significance of government decisions and allocation of resources, right? And so, again, drawing that line between what is the market economy and what are other forms of economies that are not the market economy. And so we're going to be pretty clear on that, and this is a pretty clear answer choice here. Okay, so the next question we have here, I think this all refers to loanable funds. So let's take a look at some of these questions. And so 6 says, if there's a shortage of loanable funds, then which one of the following is true? Quantity of loanable funds demanded is greater than quantity supplied, and interest rate is above equilibrium. Quantity demanded is greater than quantity supplied, and interest rate is below equilibrium. Quantity supplied is greater than quantity demanded, and interest rate is above equilibrium, and quantity supplied is greater than quantity demanded, and interest rate is below equilibrium. And so you might be like, hold up, like what is going on here? Like I don't remember talking about loanable funds. And so the loanable funds kind of question is going to be directed at not the supply and demand model, but the loanable funds market. And so the really important thing to know for the loanable funds market is just to have the graph and the relationship between the variables down. So instead of having price on the y-axis, what we're going to have is real interest rate. And on the x-axis, we have the quantity of funds. And just like supply and demand model, we still have the demand for loanable funds and the supply for loanable funds. And we can see that as interest rates are higher, the quantity demand of loanable funds is lower. And the reason for that is because high interest rates basically mean that loans are quote-unquote more expensive. That taking out a loan means that with a high interest rate, you pay more in interest back when you return the loan. And so high interest rates tend to discourage people from taking out loans, because they know that they'll have to pay a high percentage of that loan back at the end of the loan period. Similarly, if the loans were low, that basically means like loans are quote unquote cheap, and there's going to be a higher quantity demanded for loanable funds when that interest rate is low, because people know they can return the money that they loan at very low rates. So that's why the demand curve for the loanable funds market is a negative sloped curve. On the other hand, we can think of so the people who who demand loanable funds are like businesses or consumers who are taking out loans. And then you can think about the suppliers as, people who are doing something as simple as saving their money and putting it in the commercial bank, or maybe investing it or something like that, right? And so when people are saving, that rate of saving is going to be tied to how high the interest rates are. If saving is guaranteed a high interest rate, like over here, you can think of saying you open up a savings account and someone tells you it's going to be 5% interest rather than 1% interest, then you may be more encouraged to save more money that year to earn and take advantage of that high return on your savings. On the other hand, a low interest rate means that you might earn very little on any money that you put into savings. If your interest rate is something like 0.5%, after a year you earn very, very small interest returns on your savings. So there's less point of loaning out money, and instead you might want to consume more in this period. And so that's the relationship between the positive slope supply curve and interest rate. So now we deal again with this idea of a shortage of loanable funds. And just like a shortage in supply and demand, we see that a shortage of loanable funds occurs when you are at below equilibrium for whatever variable is on the y-axis, right? So taking a look at here, we can, we can draw a, draw a line across, and that's going to be our shortage. We have our quantity demand of loanable funds is very high. Quantity demand of loanable funds is very low. So our quantity supply of loanable funds is very low. And we see that this occurs because the interest rate is lower than equilibrium, right? We have a quantity demand that is high because the interest is low, so people know that loans are cheap and they're wanting to take out more loans. At the same time, people see that interest rate is low, so they're not willing to put as much of their money into savings, which can be supplied as sources of loanable funds. And this is all because the interest rate is less than the equilibrium interest rate, I star. And so we're going to look for an answer choice that validates whatever situation this is that we find ourselves in. So looking at the answers, it says answer choice B is going to be the best answer because it says quantity of loanable funds demanded is greater than the quantity supplied of loanable funds, and the interest rate is below equilibrium, and that is the case that we see here. So B is going to be the right answer for 6. So let's take a look at the tutor's answer choices, and it says if there's a shortage of loanable funds, then the quantity of loanable funds demanded is greater than quantity of loanable funds supplied, and the interest rate is below equilibrium. Hence, option B is correct. And again, that is the right answer. Next question says, we associate the term debt finance with which of the markets, and we associate the term equity finance with which of these markets? So what we're dealing with here again is a definition-based question rather than a calculation-based one. And so what we're seeing here is that you have to be familiar with debt and equity finance. And what we usually see is that debt finance refers to the bond market, and equity finance is going to refer to the stock market. And so debt finance is essentially the incurring of debt where you are borrowing money from people and promising to return it back at a later date. And that is, again, what we conventionally think of as debt. And this is one way to finance some sort of investment, so to basically raise money for a company. The term equity finance is going to refer to the stock market, and the reason it's called equity finance is because you are distributing equity in your company in order to raise money. And we can think of an IPO where you are selling off shares of the company. You give people ownership in your company in order to raise money or value for the company. And so that is another way to raise capital, and it's simply different than debt because you're not promising to return the money that you raise with equity finance. What you are is you're giving up control of a certain portion of your company and giving it to shareholders. And so that is why we associate debt finance with the bond market and equity finance with the stock market, because those are primary markets in which you would see the difference between borrowing versus equity raising. So 7 should be A. And so 7, the previous tutor got it correct. We associate the term debt finance with the bond market, and we associate the term equity finance with the stock market, and A is correct. So that is the case here. Okay, so A said, if demand for loanable funds shifts to the right, then the equilibrium interest rate does what? So let's take a look again at our graph on the right. So I'll redraw it here. Oops. We have our interest rate, so y-axis, quantity on the x-axis. We have our demand here, our supply here. And so what happens if the demand for loanable funds shifts to the right? And so we can just draw that out. And so we have this rightward shift. We have D0 and D1. And what we see happening is two things. First, we see that the quantity of loanable funds being quantity of loanable funds being traded has gone up. And the second thing that has happened is that interest rate has gone up as well. And so let's take a look at what the answer choices are. A says equilibrium interest rate and quantity loanable funds rise, and that does seem to be the case of what we're seeing happening on the graph. B says equilibrium interest rate and quantity loanable funds fall, and that's not what we see happening when we shift the demand curve to the right. C says interest rate rises and quantity loanable funds fall. That's not what we see happening. And again, D says interest rate falls and quantity loanable funds rises, and again, that's not what we see happening. So A is going to be the right answer here, and we see that if we draw it out, we don't have to do it on paper. We can if we want to, but we can also do it in our head. The demand for loanable funds shifts to the right, and the equilibrium interest rate and quantity supplied, or quantity of loanable funds rises. And so that is the correct answer as well, that the previous answer tutor chose. If demand for loanable funds shifts to the right, then the equilibrium interest rate and quantity of loanable funds rises, hence option A is correct. Great. Okay. Number 9. Long-term bonds are which of the following? And so long-term bonds are either riskier or less riskier than short-term bonds, and their interest rates are either lower or higher than interest rates on short-term bonds. So this is, again, a definition-based question, a little bit finance-related, but it refers to basically risk. And so one thing that you're going to find, if we're talking specifically about risk, is that anything that is long-term is going to be a little bit more risky than short-term. The reason for that is because you are asking bondholders to loan out money for longer periods of time than you would with short-term bonds. And by asking them to hold those bonds for longer periods of time, there's more of a chance for different things to happen. For example, the company might go bankrupt and the bondholder might not be able to receive their money back that they gave the company when they purchased the bond. And that is more likely to happen the more time that passes. And so long-term bonds would be riskier in that sense. There's a possibility that something might happen to the bondholder, and the bondholder will not be able to cash in the bond with the company at least until a certain amount of period of time has passed, even though he might wish to get the money back now. And so a lot of these factors are going to basically lead us to conclude that anything long-term is more risky than short-term. And so the question then begs what is the relationship between interest rates and risk? And the answer is that in order to motivate people to buy the riskier investment, which is long-term bonds, you have to promise them a higher return on that investment or a higher reward for waiting that long. And so that's why interest rates on long-term bonds are usually going to be higher than interest rates on short-term bonds. And so you're going to find that that payment is used to motivate people to cash in on long-term bonds, because even though there's higher risk, there's higher reward. And so let's take a look at the answer choices to see which of those answers is true. So it says long-term bonds are riskier than short-term bonds. So interest rates on long-term bonds are usually lower than interest rates on short-term bonds. So that doesn't make sense because that has the relationship between interest rate and risk flipped. So we're not going to pick A. B says riskier than short-term bonds, and so interest rates and long-term bonds are usually higher than interest rates on short-term bonds. And that is going to be the right answer. We can see C and D both say long-term bonds are less risky than short-term bonds, which is incorrect already. And so we're going to go with B. Long-term bonds are riskier than short-term bonds, and so interest rates on long-term bonds are usually higher than interest rates on short-term bonds. And so yes, that's the answer choice that the previous tutor picked as well. 10 says, compared to bondholders, stockholders face higher risk, or basically either higher or lower risk or potential for higher or lower returns, or higher or fixed payment returns. And so, the first question, bondholders versus stockholders, who faces higher risk? This is a finance-based question, but the stockholders are going to face more risk. And the reason that the stockholders face more risk is, first of all, there's volatility in the value of stocks, and so there's a higher chance that stocks are going to go down, which are going to decrease the value of the stockholder investment. And bondholders really don't have to worry about that as much. The fluctuation in bond interest rates is going to be fairly low compared to that of stocks. The second reason that stockholders face higher risk has to do with the bankruptcy laws in the country. And so, bankruptcy is one of those extreme scenarios, but if a company were to go bankrupt, they have to sell off all their assets and pay back as much as they can to their their debt owers. And so owners. And so people who hold debt in the company, which is bondholders, and this is again the difference between debt and equity financing, debt holders get first in line priority for getting paid in the event of bankruptcy. The law requires companies to pay debt to prioritize payments to the people who hold debt first. And any remaining money after all bondholders have been paid is then used to start and pay off stockholders for their shares of equity. And so what we can see is that bondholders get the first crack at receiving back their money in the event of bankruptcy, and stockholders get whatever is left, assuming that there was enough, capital raised to pay back all the bondholders and still have left over for stockholders. And so the risk is going to be higher on both fronts for stockholders. And so the reason then that we might see stockholders investing in stocks rather than bonds is because for the second portion of the question, stockholders do enjoy the potential for higher returns. And that's, again, going with the volatility of stocks relative to bondholders. There's a chance for stocks to fluctuate very rapidly on a day-to-day basis, and that can potentially have greater returns than what you would see in the interest rate return on bondholders. Bondholders, depending on what kind of bond you have, like a fixed coupon bond, they may receive a fixed payment, they may receive a lump sum at the end, but stockholders are going to be betting or investing off the potential for high returns, and you may find them have fixed payments in terms of like a stock dividend, but that's not usually a fixed payment. It's kind of dependent on what the company feels, and most people don't buy stocks in order to get the dividends. They buy the stocks to get the potential for high returns and selling off those stocks. So we're going to find that A, compared to bondholders, stockholders face higher risk and have the potential for higher returns. That's going to be the most attractive answer for us. And so 10, compared to bondholders, stockholders face higher risk and have potential for higher risk. Hence, option A is correct. So that's great. "11 says, the old adage, don't put all your eggs in one basket, is very similar to a modern bit of advice concerning financial matters. A says buy low-risk bonds, B says use a medium exchange, C is diversify, and D is intermediate. And so if we're familiar with the old adage, don't put all your eggs in one basket, the idea is if you put all your eggs in one basket and you drop the basket, then they all shatter and you've lost all your eggs. And if you carry them in two different baskets, then if you drop one of them, you still have the other half, which are fine. Which of these concepts is similar to that? So A says buy low-risk bonds. This is more so something that would be closer to risk aversion, which is saying that don't buy stocks, buy low-risk bonds. Like, make sure you can earn a minimum amount of return that is very not that risky, and you'll get your money back. And so that's more risk aversion. That's not really talking about this idea of not putting all of your investments into the same thing. B says use a medium of exchange. That's more of a function of currency than anything else, so it's not going to be that. C says diversify, and this is going to be the key uh, modern bit of advice that is referred to, is similar to don't put all your eggs in one basket. And again, the idea is that don't invest all your money into a single type of investment. Don't put all your money into the stock for one company. If you're going to buy stocks, buy a variety of stocks in a variety of different companies, and don't just buy stocks. Invest in bonds. Invest in maybe real estate. Invest in mutual funds. There's a lot of different things you can invest in, and so if you diversify your portfolio of investments, what happens is that if something bad happens to one or two of those investments, or even four or five, you still have so many other forms of investments which are unlikely to be affected that you would find that your overall portfolio is going to be safe even in the event of a bad crisis. And so the diversification is going to decrease the risk and the inherent riskiness of your portfolio, rather than focusing all of your investments into one specific arena. And that is akin to putting all your eggs into one basket. So C is going to be the closest thing to the right answer. D says intermediate, and that is more like a function of financial markets rather than anything else. And so that's not going to be the correct answer here. So diversify is the right answer, and diversify is correct. And finally, 12, a budget surplus is created if which of the following happens? A says the government sells more bonds than it buys back. B says the government spends more than it receives in tax revenue. C says private savings is greater than zero. And D says none of the above is correct. And so the answer choice that we would expect to see is that a budget surplus is created if the government spends less than it receives in tax revenue. And that is not one of the answer choices we see. So let's break it down. A says the government sells more bonds than it buys back. If it sells more bonds than it buys back, what that means is that it has increased. It has increased sells more bonds. So it has you've decreased the money supply if you sell that many bonds. And the second thing you do, in terms of by government you mean the Fed, the second thing that happens is that the government basically receives a larger influx of revenue than it on net would be increasing the government's revenue if you sell more bonds than you buy back. But a budget surplus is not dependent on just the revenue side. It is the relationship between revenue and expenditures. And so simply having a greater revenue does not ensure that a budget surplus is created. The only way to ensure a budget surplus is created if that high revenue is not offset by substantially high spending. So for example, if the government sells more bonds than it buys back, you might have high revenue, but if it spends all that money and more, then there's not going to be a budget surplus. So A is going to be kind of right, but not the best answer. B says the government spends more than it receives in tax revenue. That's not the case. That's what happens when there's a budget deficit, so we're not going to pick B. C says private saving is greater than zero. Again, that private saving is not related to government surplus or government budget, and so is pretty irrelevant to this question. And D says none of the above is correct, and I would say D is the best answer here. A budget surplus is created if the government spends less than it receives in tax revenue, and that's not one of the answers we see here. So let's take a look at the other answer choices. The answer that the tutor put. And so the answer that the tutor put says a budget surplus is created if the government sells more bonds than it buys back. Hence, option A is correct. And that I would push back on that, and I would say that's not the correct answer. So for question 12, I would say D is correct. Government budget surplus is created if government expenditure is less than its tax revenue in a given year. A is incorrect because while selling more bonds than buying them would increase government revenue, it does not necessarily lead to a budget surplus because it's possible the government could proportionally spend the government could spend proportionally more and still run a deficit. So that's going to be the correct answer here that I push back on, and we're going to mark this as incorrect just because that last question that they had here was wrong. Okay, next question says, according to the dynamic aggregate demand, aggregate supply model, what is the most common cause of inflation? And so again, remember what we said. Let me see if I can bring it back. So we had our aggregate demand, aggregate supply model, and it says, what is the most common cause of inflation? A, there's too much spending in the economy, increasing at a faster rate than total production. B, the increase in aggregate demand is greater than the increase in the long-run aggregate supply. C, rise in the input prices, and D, all of the above. And so what we have on the right is a dynamic aggregate demand, aggregate supply model that we drew earlier. And basically saying what causes inflation. And in terms of this model, inflation is referred to at any point in time where a change causes prices to increase, right? And so looking at the answer choices, A says there's too much spending in the economy, increasing at a faster rate than total production. Well, that implies what we would think of as a expansionary gap, right? If we redraw, if we want to redraw one of these. Come on. Why doesn't that go back down? So we have long-run aggregate supply. Let's say it was over here in long-run aggregate equilibrium, and then we can say maybe there's too much spending in the economy increasing at a faster rate in total production. So that would imply demand is going up because there's too much spending, and therefore we would see a price increase from here to here. That is inflation. And so that is one reason that inflation might happen, because we see only spending is increasing, but total production from the long-run aggregate supply curve is not changing, and the short-run aggregate supply curve is not changing as well. So that's one way that inflation can occur. We see that one of the answer choices is all of the above, so let's check the other ones. B says the increase in aggregate demand is greater than the increase in the long-run aggregate supply, and that's the same thing that is happening here. This increase in aggregate demand is not being met by an increase in long-run aggregate supply, and therefore we see this price increase happening, so that's true. C says a rise in the input prices, and so we can imagine, okay, well, in that case, what we might see happening is something like this. We have the long-run aggregate supply curve. We have our equilibrium, and then we might see that because input prices are rising, that short-run aggregate supply is actually decreasing, right? And so we may have short-run aggregate supply 1, short-run aggregate supply 0, and that decrease in aggregate supply is also going to cause us to have an increase in price, because we now are in a contractionary gap, and that relationship is similarly going to increase inflation. And so it seems that we have kind of nailed down that in all these cases, inflation is going to be occurring in the dynamic aggregate demand, aggregate supply model, and we can confidently pick all of the above as our answer choice. So let's take a look at what the other tutor said. So we also said all of the above, which is good. They said, the situation where the economy is operating at or near the long-run aggregate supply, an increase in aggregate demand, which is greater than an increase in aggregate supply, will lead to inflation as the curve shifts to the right, increase in the price level in the economy. So that's what we see going on in this graph right here. When spending increases at a faster rate such that there are too many dollars chasing too few goods, that is also the case. And again, that's what we see here on the left. And they say the third factor due to which inflation occurs is a rise in input prices, which leads to a leftward shift in the short-run aggregate supply curve. And so that is what we see happening on the right over here. And so yeah, this kind of hits the nail on the head, and we can say, great, draw out a graph if the relationship between the SRS and aggregate demand shifts and prices is so confusing. Yeah, I think having a graph here would be really helpful in order to really kind of add some clarity to this question. But other than that, this is a good answer, and it kind of covers the 3 reasons why we would pick all of the above. So the next question we have is this question of why does a monopolist face a downward sloping demand curve? It looks like the other tutor put a lot of thought into this answer choice, but um, we can draw out what the monopolist curve actually looks like, if that makes it a little bit easier to understand. So we have our price, we have our quantity, we have demand, supply. What makes this a monopolist curve is it also has a separate marginal revenue curve, which is separate from the demand curve. The if we assume supply is equal to marginal cost, then the intersection of marginal cost and marginal revenue tells us the profit maximization point. But instead of pricing at where we intersect here, you price, you go up to the demand curve. This is going to be your final price. And so that's what the demand curve happens, and you have deadweight loss right here. That's the monopolist curve, and it asks us, why does the monopolist face a downward sloping demand curve? And so I'm not sure why the explanation needs to be so long, because the reason the monopolist faces a downward sloping demand curve is because of the law of demand. All products have a downward sloping demand curve, with a few exceptions if you have like one of the extremes. But the law of demand tells us that as price goes up for a good, then the quantity demanded goes down, and if the price goes down for the quantity for a good, then the quantity demand is going to go up, and that relationship is constant regardless of if the market is a monopolist or if the market is in perfect competition or an oligopoly or in monopolist competition. Monopolistically competitive markets, right? That's what it is. Regardless of the form that the market takes and the number of buyers and sellers, that demand curve is always going to be downward sloping, because it is a relationship from the consumer side of how consumers interpret prices, and not a relationship with the form of suppliers or the revenue curves of suppliers. And so that downward facing demand curve is simply a function of the law of demand that we would see in any similar market. Let's take a look at the answer that the tutor gave, just to kind of see what they're talking about here. So the tutor says, a monopoly is an industry in which there's only one seller. Because of the only seller, the monopolist faces a downward sloping demand curve, the industry demand curve. The downward sloping demand curve means that if the monopolist wants to sell more, he must lower his price. We are assuming that price discrimination is not possible, and the firm can charge only one price. So because the monopolist must lower prices to sell more, the extra or marginal revenue it gets from selling another unit is less than the price it charges. Its marginal revenue curve is therefore below its demand curve. In contrast, for a seller who is a price taker, demand is identical with marginal revenue. Yeah, so that's a good explanation for why we see two separate curves, marginal revenue and demand, with marginal revenue being less. And that's because when the monopolist lowers its prices, it lowers not just it increases the quantity it sells, but also lowers the amount of money it makes per unit, and so it has to account for that by having a downward sloping marginal revenue curve that is below the demand curve. Oh, I see. So they gave a table as an example. So they said, the table below shows the case of a monopoly. MC is the value of the additional resources needed to produce another output of a unit. The marginal benefit for consumers is the price that consumers are willing to pay. This column should be recognized as the demand curve. Maximization principle tells us that the economically efficient quantity to produce is 5, which gives consumer the highest value, and that's because 5 and 5 are equal to each other here. Marginal cost is equal to marginal benefit to consumer. To produce the first unit, company uses resources valued at $5 and turns it into something valued at 7. Because the transformation has increased value, producing the first unit is economically more efficient than producing none. According to this logic, producing the 6th unit would decrease economic efficiency, because the company would take resources worth $5 and transform them into something with value of only $4.50. So that's correct. It's not. So you would never go to the 6th value for sure. And this assumes perfect competition. And the monopolist, however, will find it more profitable to produce only 3 units because it does not see marginal benefit the same way that buyers see it for the seller. The additional benefit of the second unit is only 6. He sells the additional unit for $6.51, but to sell the second unit, it has to reduce the price of charges by 50 cents. Thus, it lost 50 cents on the first unit, so net increase in its revenue was only 601. And so that is correct. This is again the idea that the only way a monopolist can sell more is by reducing its price, and by reducing price, you lose not just money on the current unit, but money on all past units that you were selling. That difference is noted by the difference between these two columns. And so, using the maximization principle, only the third unit is produced because that's where the marginal benefit to the monopolist is equal to the marginal cost of the monopolist. And so, anything else after that is actually going to cost the firm more to produce than it brings in value. And so, you would see that that's why you would have an intersection of marginal revenue, and this is the quantity supplied and not what we would see in perfect competition, which would be this quantity over here. And so this is the final figure of a monopolist's quantity of production. And so that's what we keep an eye on. I think it was a very long-winded explanation, but very, very thorough. So very thorough explanation in terms of the original question, the reason that monopolist faces a downward sloping demand curve is the same as the reason you would see a downward sloping demand curve in any other type of market law of demand. The law of demand, which tells us that as price decreases, the quantity demanded increases. So that's going to be our final, addendum to this question, and otherwise the solution is correct. So the next question says, an example of automatic fiscal policy is which of the following? The unemployment automatically become eligible for unemployment benefits when they lose their jobs in a recession. Number 2 says when interest rates automatically fall in a recession. Number 3 says Congress passes a law during a recession that automatically extends unemployment benefits for those whose benefits will soon expire. 4 says 1 and 2, and 5 says 1, 2, and 3. So the first thing we have to understand is what is automatic fiscal policy. Automatic fiscal policy refers to government policy that is going to dampen or buffer the effects of an economic downturn without anybody having to take specific action to implement it. So there's two parts. Automatic means no action, and fiscal policy refers specifically to government spending or taxes or government policy or law. It does not have to do with monetary policy at all. So taking a look at the answer choices, number 1, the unemployed automatically become eligible for unemployment benefits when they lose their jobs in a recession. That is automatic fiscal policy. It's automatic because nobody has to qualify these people for unemployment benefits or expand the program. The program already exists, and it automatically qualifies anybody who loses their job. So no action is needed by the government. And it's fiscal policy because it's a government law that implements kind of this safety for those who are unemployed. And so that's definitely going to be an example of automatic fiscal policy. B says when interest rates automatically fall in a recession. So that's not going to be the part of automatic fiscal policy, mostly because it's more related to monetary policy. When we talk about interest rates, that's something that the Fed is going to be regulating, not the fiscal government, the federal government. And so we're not going to see this as automatic fiscal policy. And C says Congress passes a law that automatically extends unemployment benefits for those whose benefits will soon expire. And while this is fiscal policy, and it would probably counteract the effects of an economic downturn, it is not automatic because it required Congress to go through the process of passing a law, debating it on the House and Senate, passing it, getting it to his desk of the president. This is something that takes effort and time, and therefore is not it's more so discretionary fiscal policy. I'm not sure if that's the exact term. It's a term that describes things that take time and effort. But Congress having to do that and go through that process means it would qualify as fiscal policy, but not as automatic fiscal policy. So we're left with just one being the right answer, and that's going to be what we end up choosing. So taking a look at the answer choices provided by the tutor, the tutor says 1 is correct. The unemployed automatically become eligible for unemployment benefits when they lose their jobs in a recession. And they say, for interest rates, changes in interest rates are a part of the monetary policy, whereas the enactment of a law by Congress is not considered automatic but discretionary. So it was discretionary as an active step that has been taken towards economic policy. The definition of an automatic stabilizer is a feature of the government budget that mitigates effects of fluctuations without demanding action from the government. So transfer payments inherently increase during a recessionary period, which finds an increase in the number of recipients. The opposite is observed during expansion. Legislation that extends unemployment benefits for those who benefit will soon expire will not be considered an automatic stabilizer. So yeah, I think this hits all the relevant points on the head. It defines automatic stabilizers, which is what we're talking about, and kind of draws that line between automatic and discretionary and fiscal and monetary. So great answer. So the next question says, when the Fed conducts an open market sales, it does which of the following? So this talks about monetary policy. And so we ought to think about what an open market sale is. And so an open market sale is when the Fed says, we're going to sell bonds, we're going to give bonds to people, which are basically pieces of paper or promises for future returns of money. And in exchange, people give the Fed money. And so what's really happening is money is transferring from the hands of the consumers, or transferring from money that is in circulation to money that the Fed now holds and doesn't use. And so that's going to end up reducing the money supply because it's taking money away from consumers and putting bonds in their hands instead. So the next thing then that we want to see is, what is the relationship between the money supply and interest rate? And so this is what we're talking about with the money supply market. And so we haven't covered that yet today, but what we're seeing here is that we're going to have a downward sloping demand curve for money. And unlike other curves where we might have a sloped supply curve, supply of money is constant, right? Yep. So this is the quantity of money. And it is not dependent on what we have on the y-axis, which is interest rates. It is fully controlled by certain things that the Fed does. And so if the Fed does something that decreases the money supply, like an open market sale, what are we going to see? We're going to see a leftward shift in the quantity of money, QM1, and we're going to have a new interest rate. So this old interest rate was IM, and this new interest rate is I1. And so that is going to increase the interest rate. And so we would find that if the Fed conducts an open market sale, the first thing that happens is a leftward shift in supply of money because the money supply is going down. And the second thing that happens is that as a result of that shift, we're going to find higher interest rates. And so 3 is going to be the best answer for the relationship we see on the money market graph. When the Fed conducts an open market sale, it reduces the money supply and raises interest rates. And so let's take a look at the previous tutor's answer. The previous tutor said that it reduces the money supply and raises interest rates, which is the case. The primary tool for an economy's monetary policy is open market operations conducted by the monetary authority, i.e. the central bank of the economy, which is the Federal Reserve for the United States. Federal Reserve conducts open market sales or purchases under its contractionary and expansionary monetary policy, respectively, to influence the money supply and subsequently the level of aggregate demand in the market. The Fed sells U.S. Treasury securities in the open market to absorb money from financial institutions that shrink their credit creation ability as a credit creation ability of absorb money from financial institutions that shrinks their credit creation ability. As the credit creation ability of commercial banks reduces, there's an increase in interest rates, which increases the cost of borrowing in financial markets. As a consequence, the level of investment decreases. Consumption spending through credit cards is also reduced, causing a reduction in the level of aggregate demand. So I think the solution explains how monetary policy is conducted to influence contractionary, expansionary policy, but could be more specific in describing the relationship asked for in the question, in the original question. When the Fed conducts an open market sale, they sell bonds to the public in exchange for the public's money. This, in effect, takes money out of circulation. On the money market graph, we would see a leftward shift in the supply of money and a new equilibrium, which results in a higher interest rate. That's why we would see that 3 would be the right answer. And so, a little typo here. But otherwise, I think this explanation is good in terms if you're trying to understand, how does the Fed go about influencing, the economy through open market sales. But this is kind of a front to tail explanation. We're really focusing on the front end of the explanation, which is what is the actual link. And I think I think this is a very conceptual explanation. I think it's really easy and important to understand the money market graph side of things. And if you can visualize these graphs, it just becomes so much easier to understand how to answer these questions. And so I wanted to add in a little bit to talk about being sure that people knew about this graph and how to interpret it. So we're going to call that correct. And it looks like that is all the questions we had for today. And so hopefully that this was helpful for you guys. We're going to keep doing these throughout the week. Other than that, I hope everybody's doing well and staying safe. And wishing you guys all the best for the rest of the day. Take care, guys.